Welcome to Ideagen TV's Dynamic Resiliency Summit. We are excited to have with us today a power note with Maurizio Vecchione, co-founder and co-general partner of AdAstral Ventures. Maurizio, welcome.
Well, thank you, George, very much for that introduction. And I'm really honored to get to speak to all of you. The subject of resiliency has never been more timely than I think as we move into 2021 from the legacy of 2020 and to some extent the consequences of the multiple stressors that have affected the planet through 2020 and are likely to continue for most of 2021. And of course, I'm talking about the pandemic, but that's not limited to the pandemic. So some of the things that I wanted to share with you today is some of the trends that I'm seeing around the subject of impact and impact investing. I was privileged enough to spend almost the last decade working for Bill Gates and trying to use the power of the private sector and the power of innovation, especially sort of scientific innovation, to deliver substantial solutions and scalable solutions to some of humanity's daunting problems. I feel like there is an experience that needs to be shared, and I feel like there is an urgent call to action on the role of the private sector and the role of impact in the future of business itself, as well as in the future of humanity in terms of solving these issues. If we read the news or if we just take a superficial approach to many problem areas in the world, we tend to get a very pessimistic view on what's actually happening in the world. And, there have been many studies done that when people are interviewed and are asked to sort of pass a judgment along various metrics, and fundamentally they're asked if the world is getting better or it's getting worse, the overwhelming majority of people will think that the world is getting worse. And of course, we're living through a pandemic, which certainly doesn't encourage us optimism. And on the other hand, when you look at objective metrics of human development, factors like chronic and intense poverty or child mortality or other sort of metrics of really human condition, I can tell you without a doubt that over the last couple of decades, the world has gone much, much better. As a matter of fact, child mortality, for example, has been cut in half, even in the poorest parts of the world. So it is possible, and I think those studies are showing that when humanity focuses on the right problems and when humanity drives solutions, often solutions that are science-based, that we can actually move the needle on solving these problems. There's something else that impresses me, and that's sort of the global population scale of many of these issues. It may be still fairly traditional to think in terms of the rich world and the poor world, and we are sort of almost congenitally trained in the West to think of the poor world as a place where bad things happen and where systemic poverty and inequity pervade, and in which business really has a hard time operating, and in which many systems, including governments, are broken. And while there is no doubt that there are many parts of the world that are still struggling with democracy, struggling with the ability to rise to their full potential. The progress is incredible. 5 of the top 10 fastest growing GDPs in the world right now are actually in what would be considered low and middle income countries. And actually a staggering statistics was presented just a couple of years ago, in which the world actually passed the point in which the concentration of wealth actually shifted from the traditional Western parts of the world, Europe, North America, and certain parts of Asia, to the rest of the world. So there's actually more wealth in what we would normally have considered the large populations, centers, and low and middle income country than in what we normally would consider the first world. And there are some profound implications about that, because the attitude that these problems have no solutions and that large problems are destined to spiral out of control, and that the world community is incapable of reacting as a global village, I think those things are proving to be wrong. And I think in some extent for those operating in the business sector that can embrace these trends, there is a secret for unlocking a really large opportunity. So both with my work with Gates, as well as in the work that I do now, I've been really focusing on what is the role of the private sector in solving some of these planetary scale problems. And one of the key conclusions that I've arrived to is that solving this planetary scale problem is not just a good thing to do for the world. It's not a charitable thing to do. It's not just an equity or equitable thing to do, but it is actually an incredible strategy for innovation that has the potential of building the scale that turns this innovation into the unicorns of tomorrow. So it's a long-winded way of saying that chasing some of the biggest problems in the world is actually a strategy for building the best future companies in the world. And if you apply that concept, the notion that chasing high impact is actually good for business, and it's good for the economic returns for those investors in those businesses, then you have the making of a redefinition of impact investing and a redefinition of the role of private sector. One of the criticism I have heard toward either philanthropic investments as well as private sector investment in these sort of big problems is that they're typically associated with really difficult issues. And they're typically associated with high risk. So often I've heard from investors, I would love to do something that can move the needle in a sector like climate change or healthcare delivery. But it becomes extremely difficult to get your arms around as a commercially minded investor on how do you pick the things that don't get you sucked into decades-long risky science experiments, as well as require government scale or even multilateral scale involvement to actually execute. And so the question that I've been fascinated with has been, how do we take the private sector, relatively short-term, relative risk-adverse appetite and make it coexist with a need for longer-term investments in building the innovation that can solve these sort of planetary scale problems. And the model that I want to suggest to all of you is that the answer lies in a grand partnership. In a grand partnership between patient capital that comes from those that are essentially investing in solutions for these problems on the philanthropic side, combined with the execution capacity and speed of of the classic venture type of investors. And I think when you combine the two, you have the opportunity to create a new type of investment vehicle. It's an investment vehicle that will stage its capacity by beginning a systemic curation of problem spaces that are fit. They're big ideas, they're big impacts, but they're also fit to a solution that is based on science, technology, and innovation. And if you curate those grand challenges, for lack of better words, using philanthropic dollars, and I want to stress that defining problems is just as important as devising the solutions, because if you don't understand the problem deeply, you're likely to have a solution that doesn't actually solve the problem and move the needle on the impact. But if we started out by partnership with those philanthropic institutions that have the patient capital and the mission horizon to really understand deeply the problem spaces and to essentially provide the definitions to those grand challenges, and then partner with those institutions to provide the early de-risking capital on the innovation that is likely to bring the solution. What you can do is essentially advance the solution space through the very risky stages, but then get it to a point in which it's ready for what I call its translational capacity, when it's ready to become a company, when it's ready to be part of a company for actual implementation. And so you have sort of the staged deployment of capital, where at the beginning of the cycle, you're deploying non-dilutive, charitable type of funding, typically in partnership with charitable organizations. And then as it becomes de-risked sufficiently to fall into the investment horizons of classic venture investors, then you assume the risk and you inject the capital for scale up, for execution, and for market-driven execution using classic venture discipline. And so to some extent, you are blending what charities are really good at with what companies and ultimately investors in those companies are really good at. Charities are much better at the long game, at defining the big picture, and at incubating the fundamental science that will drive those solutions. They're actually not very good at the later stage execution, including the scale up. And on the flip side, venture and classic corporate activities are very good at that later stage, and they struggle with these sort of early risk driven big picture questions. So this is all a long-winded way of calling all of you to action, because whether you're sitting on the corporate side and on the private sector side, or whether you're sitting on the philanthropic and charitable side, I think it's time to come together to create resiliency in a system that begins to dramatically move the needle across the big problems that face us. You know, it has been said that the pandemic that we're living through, it's an unprecedented, some people have called it unpredictable event. And people have talked about this kind of pandemic as being, you know, every 100 years or every 500 years. Let me tell you, since the 1980s, there have been 22 pandemic potential epidemics. And we've averted disaster in some of the other circumstances only by sheer luck. And we're still living through one of those pandemics, the HIV/AIDS pandemic, without a cure and without a vaccine. So, you know, if you actually plot the frequency of these pandemics over time, you'll discover that we are actually seeing an acceleration So there's something going on in the interaction between human beings, between the environment, the planet, the zoonosis or interaction with animals that are actually aggravating the pandemic potential of the world. And I'm sure you've all heard the experts talk about, beyond dealing with the current pandemic, we have to start building the resiliency and the mechanisms to prevent the next one, because there will be a next one, and it may be sooner than you think. Well, to me, that's a canary in the coal mine example. That's evidence of the fact that the stressors that we're bringing in at the planetary scale, whether it's the environmental crisis, whether it's the climate crisis, whether it's human population, the impacts of that population growth, the impacts of having soon a 10 billion people planet, those are going to start accelerating these crises. And these problems, even though I started out by telling you that the world has gotten better, but the trends that often have gone unsolved and allowed to fester are also going to accelerate the crisis. And so this is the time to start thinking about novel funding and novel commitments, where in the future, I think the great companies of tomorrow will not just be great companies from an investor return and a financial return, but will also be great companies from the impacts that they generate. And in thinking about that, and in going back to the initial commentary I gave you, that that impact is also a strategy to build the great companies of tomorrow. I hope you see that the two are actually linked, and the two can actually leverage each other. I would venture to say that the great brands of tomorrow, the great resilient brands of tomorrow, are very unlikely to be companies that don't also have great impacts on their customers, on their communities, on the planet. And so, I am currently engaged in creating, as a case study, in creating an investment vehicle that blends this sort of charitable early capital with, in a non-dilutive way, with venture discipline later stage capital for execution. And that is trying to operationalize these very concepts in partnership with companies and governments around the world. We are looking at problems like malnutrition and how do we feed a 10 billion people planet in the future. At the time when it's obvious that if we scaled up agricultural production, animal consumption, and other things to essentially give us the capabilities to feed that population, we will end up without enough land, and we will end up ruining the planet from various environmental impacts. So how do we evolve the business of food out of the traditional environmental impacts? Those are the kind of mega problems that I am throwing a great challenge to everyone, and that we're trying to address using this sort of hybrid investment model that I just described. Anyway, I hope you found these comments useful. I make an invitations to all of you to join us in trying to address the resiliency of the planet, the resiliency of our community, and the solutioneering of these big problems from the perspective of private business. And if you are on the charitable or philanthropic side, I also invite you to join us so that there is this sort of combined execution power in this grand partnership. Finally, I didn't mention the role of government, but government plays a fundamental role in enabling both sides of this equation, and so as a result, it's a third rail in this sort of grand coalition that I've described. But government can't be relied to be the only source of that sort of patient long-term capital. As we are clearly seeing from, the enormous investments that organizations like the NIH are making in healthcare, and they've made great progress, and they're allowing a lot of early science to develop. Yet the capacity to translate that science into ultimately executable companies and products that save lives has remained still very narrow. And people in biotech speak of the value of that to indicate that sort of transition from pure research to clinical and commercial applications as being a place where much innovation gets lost. So these are all the themes that I worry about, and this is all the themes that I would urge our greater community to begin to action operationally. I am optimistic that by embracing these concepts, we have a very bright future ahead for the planet and for our communities. Thank you very much.